He's a local boy, really. He got a summer job 30 years ago, last summer, at Shonnard's working on the landscape crew. And in fact, when I first met Darren, he was setting up a landscaping display at one of the Home Orchard Society fall fruit shows back in the early 90s. Later, he asked if he could work in the garden center, and they gave him the chance, and he took on many new tasks, learned many new things. And at this point, he is now the manager of the garden center at Shonnard's. He specializes in trees and shrubs, edible gardening, and he's developed a passion for pollinators through the nursery's beekeeping division. Darren also teaches community education classes and workshops through Lynn Benton Community College. Darren, we're very pleased to have you tonight. Welcome, and we're looking forward to your talk.
Thank you, Alan. Appreciate it. Wonderful intro. Always good to work with the Master Gardener organization, so this is fun. I've been putting this one off for a number of months now, so it'll be good to get going. I'm going to go ahead and get my slideshow going here, and we'll kind of run through the early gardening season. All right, so as Alan suggested here, we are in a cold time of the year, and there's not tons happening in the garden of the very immediate persuasion. But there's a surprising number of tasks that start as early as mid to late January, and you can kind of get your garden up and going and rolling into the season. The early crops give you a chance for some early harvests, as well as making a smooth transition to the main growing season. So when you're looking at what your garden is like in the winter, it might be as simply bare as the little raised bed up in the upper right picture here. Hopefully not. There's better things to do with your garden space. You could also have some overwinter and winter harvest crops still sitting in the garden. Cabbages, Brussels sprouts, overwintering cauliflower, sprouting broccoli, various types of garlic and onions might all be crops that are actively still growing in the garden this time of year. Hopefully, if you don't have anything active, you've got either a good layer of mulch on to conserve your soil or some cover crops to work with. All these situations are great with your garden, and all of them will require slightly different approaches as you make the transition to the main season. So we'll get the garden season started. There are likely to be a few winter harvest crops in. Greens crops still go through all the winter and will be producing and actually start speeding up again really rapidly. What gets surprising about the winter garden is the transition happens so much earlier than you think. Soil temperature matters a lot more than air temperature on these cold season crops. And our equinox or solstice rather was quite a few weeks back, and so the sun angle is slowly increasing, and the soil temperatures are coming up, and plants are actually beginning to initiate new growth again. By the time you hit February, a lot of the overwintering crops are very actively growing and noticeably growing. So there's some crops in or some cover crops in to be looking at. This is also a great time to do some planning stages. I don't want to knock your suggestion of sipping cocoa by the wood fire reading through seed catalogs, because we do a lot of that in January as well as active gardening. And this is the time to make some concrete plans because you're going to need to be getting supplies and getting some things rolling if you're looking even towards the main season. In terms of how much space are you allocating for the garden, what kind of crops are you planning on growing there, how much are you going to need, how much space, how much seeds, what kind of supplies are you going to need. But even in the outside tasks, the active gardening season actually really does start in late January. There are crops to be planted and seeds to be started inside even that early. So some considerations. Existing crops, mulches, weeds if you haven't been taking care of everything, or cover crops are things you're going to need to deal with as you move into planting, whether you're planting now or planting in May. And we'll talk a bit more detail about that as we get towards the end of the presentation with the transition, but the same kind of impacts are going to be felt on early plantings. More importantly, in our immediate area, these heavy soils, wet and clayey, often make it very difficult to get a new crop in. You've got to be able to do a certain amount of working in the soil The crops you can muck in, but everything's going to do better if you can do a reasonable amount of soil amending. And these very low soil temperatures make plants grow relatively slowly and really inhibit seed germination. That's the biggest limiting factor on what you can do when is not air temperature, but is soil temperature. An often overlooked consideration for very early season gardening is nutrient availability. We all like to garden organically, and unfortunately, organic granular nutrients and even manure type nutrients have a very limited availability in these low soil temperatures. The microbes that are essential for the breakdown of components of these fertilizers just are not very active in these really low temperatures. So it becomes important, whether we're talking about starting seeds inside or planting out in the garden, to have available organic nutrients. And that usually means some sort of a liquid nutrient of one form or another. Also relevant to that is the slow activity of the rhizobium type bacteria for legumes. Legumes are some of the earliest crops we can put out, noticeably peas. And even if you have a reasonable rhizobium population in your soil, that rhizobium may not be as active and moving into the nodules as fast as you want it to. So putting an inoculant of rhizobium on the seed or in the furrow at planting is really beneficial. A lot of times with my later plantings, I'll take or leave inoculating. With my early plantings, I almost universally inoculate because it just gives you that one more step up towards success. So when we're talking about early season gardening, obviously the most direct example of gardening is sowing plants and sowing seeds. And direct seeding is limited by soil temperature, but there's a little chart up here that will show you some of your options. This early in the season, I would stick to peas only, and even that somewhat advisedly. They're going to grow quite slow. They're likely to be damaged by insects like pea weevils if they don't get a good, robust start. But by the second or third week of January, you can actually physically plant pea seeds outside. Theoretically, you can do lettuce, onions, perhaps even radishes this early as well. But the germination rates in our current soil temperatures are so darn low that I usually wait on those until February or even March. By March, most of your really cool season crops can be started from seed, but your cole crops, your cabbages and kale, cauliflower and broccoli, really need quite a bit of temperature to germinate at all. So unfortunately, even though they're some of the most cold hardy plants, they are not the best early germinators. And you often, if you're going for early plantings, will have to start them inside. So by March, spinach and beets. By April, perhaps carrots if you're ambitious and your soil texture isn't too bad. I almost never get my carrots in until May because I can't really get a decent soil texture and it crusts over too bad. The quickest and easiest germinating cole crops are cabbage and kale, and they could go in as early as April. But most other cole crops really do need to wait until the very end of April, or even early May. One of the limits you see on these is your actual physical limitation on germination is of a higher temperature than these guidelines might suggest, but a lower temperature than these guidelines might suggest. But time is of the essence. So when you put lettuce seed down in January, it will germ. It just might take 100 days to germ, thus not being any more effective than simply waiting and getting a much better take a little bit later in the season. So soil temperatures have to be high enough. I do really recommend a soil thermometer. You can certainly go by guidelines. There are some great charts. If you look at some of the historical documentation at Oregon State, there are some listings of dates with average soil temperatures. But you will find that your soil temperature varies not only with the ongoing sun angle and such, but also how much plant cover you have on it, if the sun's hitting the soil surface or not. So dense cover crops actually slow down your soil temperature increase somewhat versus thinner crops or bare soil. So if I go through and check my garden usually in late January or early February, and I throw my soil thermometer in a few different locations, I come up with 3 or 4 different numbers. They're usually pretty close to each other, but they're certainly not exactly the same. So you might find some variation. Raised beds warm up a little faster typically, for example. Soil moisture, and you'll see a couple pictures a little later on here that show what my soil moisture issues are in the winter. Soil moisture is a problem because if you seed a crop out and then you flood, you've lost that crop. Or if your soil texture is so bad that you're clodding, a lot of plants just won't take that, particularly things like carrots or even radishes. They don't like a really heavy, cloddy soil, and you need to be able to get a decent texture or seeding will be ineffective. The other limits you come into are the actual weird cold snaps that happen this time of year. And yes, the plants we're talking about are pretty darn cold hardy, but 6 inches of snow on newly sprouted plants will kill them, even if they're hardy. Sudden snaps down to 5-degree nights will kill a fair percentage of these young plants, even though if they were older, they would be more hardy. So I never bet the whole season's crop on my early seedings, but I do a fair amount of early plantings to get some things rolling. So Kathleen out in the chat had mentioned using comfrey extract and using that as a nutrient resource. And that is a good liquid feed nutrient resource, or other forms of compost tea, for example, or you can do chicken manure, rabbit manure, leachings, where you actually take an aged manure and you run some water through it that actually soak through. So those are great sources. Those sources tend to degrade pretty rapidly. And so she's asking, 4 months after extraction, your nutrient value is pretty substantially diminished. It does depend on how much air exposure it's had and some other factors there, but I would not expect a nutrient solution, a liquid nutrient solution like that, to hold for 3 or 4 months. A couple of weeks, yes. So that's kind of some answers in there. And there's lots of good ways to get some liquid nutrients out there. Even dry manures, a certain percentage of them are soluble enough that the rain will take them in. It's just a pretty low percentage, why we usually do extractions or teas to get more concentrated availability of those nutrients. I love the idea of using the comfrey as a nutrient source. Got a lot of micronutrients too, but I so hate working with comfrey plants. They're so aggressive that I usually won't take that approach myself. So some guidelines as far as soil temperatures and direct seeding. And anybody taken a soil test lately? You should be usually in the upper 40s by late January. It does depend a little bit. You probably haven't hit 50 degrees in most locations yet for soil temperatures. So peas will actively germinate all the way down to freezing technically, but effectively anything above about 40 or 45 degrees will provide adequate pea germination. Onions, chard, lettuce, radishes will also germinate all the way down to freezing, but as I mentioned earlier, at such a slow rate that it's seldom worthwhile. Soil temperature also impacts some types of transplanting, and potato tubers are a classic example of that. You could plant seed potatoes in February at 45 to 50 degrees soil temperature, but they're going to grow really, really slow, and the potential for causing degradation of the crop through rot is fairly significant. I usually wait. Again, if you have really well-drained raised beds and you want to push the end of February, yeah, go for the potatoes that early, but not in my native clay. That's just not viable. Spinach and beets are usually the next thing up in that 50 to 55 degree range. And then talked earlier about the coals and their limitations. They really require above 55 degrees soil temperature for decent germination. Remember that soil germination and soil temperature for germination is only one significant part of the seeding equation, because theoretically, by the time you're hitting, say, the end of March, first part of April, and your soil temperatures are consistently above 55 degrees, you might consider seeding beans. But you can frost out beans, where you really won't frost out cabbage and broccoli as long as you can get them to germinate. So some guidelines here, but always keep in mind that When in doubt, if you wait a week or two, you'll probably be ahead of the game rather than pushing out to the very, very earliest possible opportunities, because the germination speeds up pretty dramatically with even just a couple of degrees of difference in soil temperature. So some tricks you can use to improve your overall success in seeding. Get your soil temperature up by using covers. You can use dark covers like a weed barrier fabric. Clear covers work great because if they're thick enough to give you any insulation at all, they let some light through to the soil rather than heating the fabric and thus heating the shallow parts of the soil with the heat of the fabric. Letting the sunlight through and then trapping the residual heat inside actually heats more and more depth of the soil. The issue with using clear covers to enhance your soil temperature for seed starting is you don't want to do it for too long, because all of your weed seeds are going to start germinating in there too. So it's kind of a balancing act with the clear ones, where the dark does not tend to increase the weed seed germination as much. Pre-sprouting, particularly large seeds that are easy to handle sprouted, does a really good job. So if you put your peas and you figure out how many you want to plant in your row, and you damp them in some wet paper towels for about 4 or 5 days, they hit the stage you see in that top picture there with the newly emerging sprout coming out of the swollen seed. At that stage, as long as you're handling them gently, they will handle really well and they'll transplant in really well. This saves you 10, maybe 12 days of very slow swelling up and initial germination stage out in the 35-degree wet soil. You can also pre-soak seeds that you're not going to hold long enough to sprout. This also speeds up that germination stage by getting them swollen under warmer temperature water. And you want to do that for just a day or two. We do that for seeds that are often too small to actually bother pre-sprouting and transplanting. And it can make a significant difference in your germination success at lower temperatures. Your soil temperature is great and your texture is lousy. You can work some composts in or other soil amendments in to improve that texture some. Do that advisedly, because in these clay soils, it's really easy to make a cloddy, mucky mess. But if you're on the borderline of dry enough to work, that can make a big difference. Crops like peas really are not that soil particular. You can muck them in. They can take a reasonably cloddy soil. Lastly, nothing hurts so much as spending the time and effort to get your seedling crops up and then having a whole batch of snow or hail or even a really bad windstorm take down some young plants. So use covers to protect those crops, whether that's floating row covers as a primary temperature protection, or more staked covers or rigid covers like cloches to provide more structural support. Even heavy rains can sometimes be damaging just by sheer impact on very young seedlings. So aside from starting seed outdoors, you can start a lot of crops inside. Most crops do better on the early crops if you start them inside and then transplant them out, because they just get a better start. The amount of time it takes to go from seed in the pot to transplantable size varies tremendously from crop to crop. We're going to talk about that a couple of slides down here. Now, bear in mind, not all crops really transplant well, and a lot of the ones we do transplant actually do quite well from seed, so you have either option. A good example of that is in the later season, things like melons and squash. Certainly you can transplant them, but I have a much higher success rate direct sowing them at the appropriate time than I ever do handling transplants, even though the transplants are buying me maybe 3 weeks of growing time. So once you have your seed in the pot, a certain amount of light is essential for good germination for most crops. And you're going to need to provide either a very bright natural windowsill or some full spectrum lighting or some grow lights to provide adequate lighting for good germination, but also for good development post-germination up until the time you transplant. For me, this is my biggest limiting factor right now for starting seeds indoors. I have one decent windowsill, and my cat loves that windowsill in the winter just as much as my plants do. And she's not plant friendly. So that is a bit of a challenge for spacing. And if I get really excited about doing a lot more indoor starting, I'm going to have to set up a little grow room with grow lights where I can keep her under control and out of it. The other need in your indoor started seeds is for nutrients. So when your seed first sprouts, it's got the cotyledons, the seed leaves. For most of your vegetable crops, that's 2 seed leaves, but onions, for example, have 1, or grains have 1, monocots. And that is still growth that is coming from the stored energy of the seed. You can think of the seed like the yolk of an egg from which the adult develops. The same thing in the seed. The germplasm of the seed has a stored energy and enough to get the plant growing. That gets it through its seed leaf stage where it can start getting oriented and get some light, and then up through about its first true leaf. It's living on stored energy. By the time you actually have true leaves, these are leaves that no longer look like cotyledons, but actually look at least somewhat like the adult leaf will look. That seed is out of energy. If you're doing this right, you're doing this in a sterile seed starting mix, so you're not actually bringing in microorganisms that cause diseases on those transplants, on those seedlings when they're so young. There's absolutely no nutrients in a seed starting mix on purpose. It's sterile. So you're going to need to provide nutrients from that point of the first true leaf all the way up through the point you are ready to either pot them up for some crops into a larger pot for additional aging with a potting soil that has some nutrients, or ready to transplant them out and get them establishing in their permanent home. So it can be simple. You do not have to make this complex. A lot of people get intimidated by starting seed inside. You can start 3 plants you want to start for transplant out in 3 Jiffy pots on a windowsill in a dish. It's really very simple. On the other hand, if you're very excited about it and you have plenty of space and you want to play with the options, there are lots of supplies that can make it more complicated, but also more effective on a larger scale, with humidity domes, heat mats to control the bottom temperature to enhance your germination, lighting systems, all kinds of things you can do to make it a larger scale project. Besides, there's enough people out there that are techie enough that they want all the gewgaws and gadgets to do it, even if it's not the easiest or best way to do it. So to improve your overall inside starting success, a few things that you can keep in mind. Pretty much all of our vegetable crops will germinate better with some bottom heat. Your ambient temperature inside, most people do not keep their house at a nice steady 72 degrees, which would be great for starting seedlings. Typically, your house fluctuates, and particularly in the windowsill where a lot of starting is often going on, or out in a sunroom or out in a insulated garden shed with lights, your temperatures are lower than that. And that does make a significant difference, particularly with some crops like nightshades, where the bottom heat is very, very important. Learn your crops. We'll go through a bit of it here, but there's more you can learn on it than I can cover in the time I've got it here in one presentation. Crops, some crops you can plant on, you can grow on. You can start them early when they start getting too big for their britches where they're at. You can transplant them into a larger container and get bigger transplants and be that much more ahead of your gardening season. This is particularly true of your nightshades, your tomatoes and peppers. They handle well, they transplant well, they're easy to transplant 2 or 3 times and get really nice big transplants to work with. Other crops really just don't do that well. And notable, the cucurbits, the melons and cukes and squashes hate being transplanted at all. They're kind of finicky in the first place, and doing it more than once is just asking for trouble. Other crops simply have a timer on them. Cole crops are a good example of this. You give them some space and they grow pretty rapidly, but they don't want to really fill up that space and become an all root bound. It really inhibits their later development if you start getting any impact on roots. Same thing if you try to start root crops like carrots or turnips or rutabagas. It's certainly doable, but your limiting factor is, are you damaging that root system by root binding faster than you're getting that crop in the ground? So really, really fast germinating crops like radishes and most root crops, though there are some playing around with that can be done, really don't benefit. You're ahead to simply wait until your appropriate direct direct sowing outside rather than trying to start them inside. So your time frame, I'm going to flip back and forth between a couple of slides kind of quickly here a few times. So these guidelines here have to do with how long it takes to get a crop ready to plant, and then when that crop can successfully go out. So in January, indoor starting, we might be starting peas. You can plant them directly outside, but you can get bigger peas faster by starting them inside and then transplanting them. Onions and cabbage, plants that are super hardy as long as you get them through their germination stages. They can be started in January. In February, we might be starting inside beets. If you're going to try a root crop from seed, it's one of the better ones to try from seed. A little aside on that, I love to start beets from seed and then transplant them. I don't bother with most other root crops. When you look at a beet seed, it's not a seed, it's a drupe, it's a fruit. Inside that drupe are several seeds, usually something around 6 seeds. So every time you plant a beet seed, you get about 6 sprouts that come up, and beets do not tolerate crowding, so you have to thin. If you do a judicious job of seeding your beets in 6-packs, and then when they're still young, you're ready to transplant them, you take them and you separate them out, you actually get a much easier success rate by separating them very young from the cell pack than going through and trying to thin them in the ground from a direct sowing. By February, you could also start most cole crops and a great number of leaf crops for transplant. And the guidelines here are when to start inside to transplant out. So if we're starting our cabbages inside in January, cabbages take about 3 to 4 weeks, maybe as many as 5 weeks to hit transplantable size. So we'd be talking about a February transplant. Same thing with typically with peas and onions, about 3 to 4 to maybe 5 weeks from seed to transplant. If you're starting your beets from seed inside in February, you're transplanting in March, and so on. But this seems really straightforward at first in the first few examples, because most of our really hardy crops take about 4 weeks, give or take, from seed to transplant. But in February, we're starting peppers. You're not going to be planting your peppers outside in March. Peppers take 10 to 12 weeks from seed to transplantable. They're one of the longer crops from the seed starting season. So we start them in February, usually the latter part of February, for an April to early May transplant. And as we go down onto the chart, we see the same thing in March. March is a great time to start beans, because if you can get them up and established in 4 or 5 weeks in transplants, they can go out by mid to late April for sure. Tomatoes take 6 or 8 weeks to hit transplantable size. Now, can you start your tomatoes in January? Sure, you just can't plant them out when you're ready, and you need to be aware that you're going to have to transplant them up, because these really leggy 1.5 foot tall tomato plants in a 4-inch pot often have some stress issues when you finally get around to transplanting. So you can push the envelope back in the starting time if you can transplant that crop, and if you're willing to transplant the crop. April, corn, cucumbers, melons, these are all plants that take about 4 weeks or so to reach transplantable stage. So planning for May transplant of melons and cukes. Even with protection, there's no sense in trying to get them out any earlier than about the middle of May. Oh, that's a picture from a few years ago. She's 13 now. So planting the garden and transplanting, this is a May picture, as you might imagine. So the other end of planting, besides the seeding, is the transplanting, and whether that's making your own transplants from starting your own seed, or buying transplants in the garden center or store. And we do a lot of this in the main season crops, because it's the most practical way to handle the vast majority of those hot season summer crops. So basically, the advantage to buying or doing your own transplants is time, plus the pleasure of doing it, of course, if you're doing your own, but time. Because you could certainly start tomatoes by seed, and if you leave rotting tomatoes in your garden, you'll find that they do okay sprouting from seed directly in the soil. But you need that extra season, because tomatoes are kind of a hard crop to get enough heat for to ripen. So having that benefit to your season not only is pushing the harvest earlier, but on some of these really long cycle crops, crops like tomatoes and like peppers may be the only way you can successfully get them off. And that's really different from other hot season crops like watermelons, which take forever, but do just fine from a direct seeding and don't really require quite as long of a cycle. Remember that our last frost date in the valley is technically listed as May 15th. I've seen a frost on the ground on the 18th of May, the latest I've actually physically seen a frost on the ground in Corvallis. So plants that are at all frost sensitive need to be protected or simply not put out any earlier than. And we talked about temperature sensitive crops, but we'll just clarify, nightshades, peppers and tomatoes will tolerate a bare bones frost barely. It does set them back, but they will survive it. Eggplants won't. Most melons are not frost tolerant. Even a light frost will damage them. Cucumbers might tolerate a very bare bones frost. So these typical hot season crops are very sensitive. The worst of the batch really have as much to do with cold soils as actually frost tolerance. So basil and sweet potato, it's not just that they're frost intolerant because they're fairly frost intolerant, but also when the soil temperatures are low and they're not growing vigorously, they're really sensitive to rot or other forms of degradation and damage. So they need to be not only warm enough to not freeze, but also warm enough to be actively growing. So if you're going to try to push your envelope here and go out earlier than that May 15th date, take the steps to protect those plants. And honestly, even with mid-May plantings, I will a lot of times use various types of covers and underlays just to speed up the growing cycle on these warm season plants. So some general recommendations to improve your transplanting is to, first of all, do not let transplants get to root bound. Whether you're shopping from the store, inspect them carefully. If you're growing your own, make sure you try to time your seeding carefully to plant them out when it's safe, but before they're so root bound or otherwise stressed that they fail. And it can be challenging unless you've got a really good setup to keep your seedlings very, very happy with lighting and space. Soil temperature and air temperature become more important often than soil temperature by this point in time. Air temperatures and frost, as I mentioned, and then texture. So I'm on a heavy clay soil in a wetland environment. My soil description says my winter water table is from 2 inches below the soil surface to 1 inch above. I am technically true wetland environment. So a lot of my gardening happens late May or sometimes even June when my soil finally dries down enough to work. When in doubt, wait. We have quite an adequate growing season for almost anything you might want to try. I mean, yes, if you want beefsteak tomatoes, you might have some challenges, but we have a pretty good season. And generally speaking, you're ahead to wait till conditions are better rather than try to push the envelope earlier if there's any inclement conditions. Stress won't kill a plant always, but stress can set a plant back. And the difference between a tomato plant planted in mid-May and a tomato plant planted the second week of June, that plant planted the second week of June often has better production and sometimes earlier production simply because it hasn't been set back several times due to cold snaps. Whether you're buying a transplant at a nursery or starting your own, you can't just go from indoor temperatures to directly outdoors. They shock, so both lighting and actual temperatures. So it's important you take a couple of days to stage your transplants out. Now, a lot of the nurseries, like for us, we have an unheated greenhouse that our vegetable starts go in. And after a few days out in that, they're conditioned. But when they're coming the same day from the grower in their hot houses where they're pushing these crops on to finish, they will shock if you put them out those first day or two after we get them. So a hardening off transplant is a relatively simple step to ensure your success. And it's simply take your plants out for a few hours into a protected, bright shade environment for a few hours for a day, and maybe a few more hours the next day, maybe the third day all day, but bring them in at night, and then finally transplant out. Now, if you take the time to kind of stage them out carefully so that they get a chance to adapt to their new environment, you'll have much less chance to have shock and failure. So another way to harden plants off is to use a cold frame. So cold frames and hotbeds are kind of two ends of the same situation. A cold frame is an unheated covered space where the only temperature improvement is by trapped heat. So this would be an unheated small greenhouse or an actual bed that's been built up with a short frame specifically for a cold frame. So these are great for starting cold early season crops, for direct sowing them to then prick out, lift out, and transplant later. They're also great for getting a jump start on some of these more temperature sensitive plants. You can, with a typical, like a soft plastic cover on a decent sized cold frame, you're getting 2 to 3 to maybe 4 degrees of improvement, enough to make your May cycle be maybe a late April cycle, 2 to 3 weeks in advance. So you can move some tomatoes out from inside to a cold frame. This will harden them off and should have enough protection that they can keep growing for a while prior to transplanting out after all frost risk. They can also be used in the latter part of the season to give you some long fall and into the winter harvest, particularly for leaf crops, which you need a little protection and a little extra temperature to keep growing actively enough to continue harvesting. Hotbeds are kind of the opposite of that. They're intentionally heated, often with bottom heat, whether they use mats or heat generating cables, kind of serpentine through the hotbed. They're great for germinating crops that require a little more heat, but are otherwise hardy, more heat to germinate, but are otherwise hardy. For example, cole crops, you can use a hotbed to get them up and growing and then stage them outside. Or again, for pushing greens crops into the winter harvest cycle. Hotbeds are something that 25 years ago, I got a lot of questions about, and it's almost kind of a lost thing. People are not doing as much of that kind of extra step gardening as they used to. So the other way to gain some front end of the season is to use underlays and covers. And I say it's beneficial to do this even if you're not intentionally pushing the edge of the season, but to get things off to a good start on the early part of the main season. So some classic examples. So underlays. In our top left picture here, you have some red SMR red films for nightshades in particular. Simply a wavelength of light is reflected back into the plant that should enhance its growing characteristics specific to nightshades and also strawberries. In the bottom right-hand corner, you see just some weed barrier fabric used as an underlay. My opinion on that, having played with them fairly extensively for several years, is the darker color for some heat generation seems to make a lot more difference than the actual wavelength of light. I've gone back to using pretty much exclusively just weed barrier, and not always these big expanses like you see in this garden out west of Philoma. I use small sections, like a 3 foot by 3 foot section of weed barrier fabric with a cross slit cut in it. And I simply plant through that for all of my hot season crops that like a little extra temperature. And it does a few things. It heats the soil. It helps keep, like any mulch, keeps a little moisture in there, reduces some of the evaporative losses of moisture. It also keeps weeds down in the immediate crown around that plant. So it gives us several benefits out of that. Covers are designed to provide protection from air temperature. An open tunnel cover, like in this bottom left picture, is not really gaining much because it's open at the end and it's airflow. This picture was intentionally opened. This was actually pinched closed at the end. You can build up too much heat on sunny days in February and March if you still have your covers on. And so sometimes you have to ventilate them. Some of them do not breathe well enough, and that's the case here. When you look at the little, what they call a fleece cover, it's a little tunnel cover here with the wire ribs. I've got some peas growing under that, simply speeding them up a little bit. That one breathes pretty well and even lets a little bit of moisture through. So the difference between essentially a sheet plastic cover and a breathable cover, although the sheet plastics will give you a little extra insulation, the breathable covers often require less extra care in overheating. The red covers over the tomato cages are a kind of a tidy, simple way to get some extra insulation around your nightshade crops. They do not have to be the red, but they make these commercial red ones that are just the right size to go over a small tomato cage like that, so kind of handy. They are breathable. They've got slits in them, so they're not perfect air circulation, but they do air trapping for heat. But they do provide at least several degrees of temperature, usually about 2 degrees of temperature improvement for the air temperature, enough to make a late April versus a mid-May transplanting at least possible. If you're going to really push out to mid-April for nightshades, use something like the Wall of Water or mini greenhouses like you see here. So Wall of Water is a name brand. There's several other Cozy Coats and such. And so what those are is those are rings of tubes, and then you fill them part way or most of the way with water, and you can actually still close off the tops while the plants are young, creating a whole greenhouse. That water absorbs heat from the sun, even on a cloudy day, and then releases it much more slowly than just an air entrap cover like that. So it keeps a lot more temperature over a longer period of time around those plants. As a plant gets bigger or the temperature warms up a bit, you can then open out those cylinders and don't keep them pinched at the top anymore, enabling them to breathe and enabling the plant to grow up a bit. Because they are somewhat subject to breakage, I usually try to take my Wall of Water type covers off as we get into the main growing season and we don't need them anymore. Whereas these greenhouse covers, a lot of times I just untie the top and just slide them down. They're fairly durable and they're relatively cheap if I do ruin them. These Wall of Water and similar are a little more expensive. So these are all steps you can take both to speed up your season, but also to have more success even if you're waiting up until the appropriate times of the season. And I've got no objection with people trying to push their seasons a bit, but my experience really has been that the 2-week difference in between a late April and a mid-May transplant is usually not worth trying to push that extra 2 weeks. You're just ahead to wait. You'll actually have better results overall. So SMR red film, we talked about as for nightshades and strawberries. There's also a green film for cucumbers and greens crops. And the idea behind these is sound, and they've done some tests on them and such. And I think if you were doing large-scale tomato farming and you measured your yield in a whole section that you did that in and a section you didn't do that in, you would find they are effective. For the home gardener doing a couple of plants, they're probably not really any more beneficial than simple weed barrier fabric. We talked earlier about clear, non-permeable covers for soil heating too, and the issue is primarily weed growth. Other than that, they work just fine. In fact, some ways they heat the soil a little better than darker covers. Over-the-top covers, Rime and fleece can be in plant contact. Rime is simply a brand name of a spun white fabric that provides some insulated value. So you can literally drape them over robust plants with no support structure and simply weight down the edges. On more delicate plants or plants that are growing fairly actively, you want to put some kind of support under that Rime so you're not bending your plants or breaking your plants. But they can actually be in plant contact. Clear plastic film cannot. If your clear plastic film, even a lightweight film, is actually in contact with your plants, you will have burns. You'll get frost burns and sometimes sunburns where that plastic touches. So they have to be more widely supported over the outside of the plants. So Rime, fleece, and fleece, by the way, isn't fleece, it's just another type of spun fabric. Hot caps are all things that will give you maybe 2 to 3 degrees of insulative value overall as far as nighttime minimums. Quite a bit more different sometimes on a sunny day on highs. Cloches are usually a rigid structure. They're usually even more insulative, depending on what they're made of. It's not uncommon to get 4 or 5 degrees out of a well-insulated cloche. So when you're talking about 4 or 5 degrees, we're now talking, instead of mid-May, we're talking about maybe as early April. That's that close of a difference over that kind of a time span. The big issue I have with both clear plastic films and cloches is air circulation and water. If you're using cloches or you're using clear plastic films, you have to get under in water unless you're getting plenty of leach through from the sides. This becomes an issue a lot of times in raised beds where you're covering most of the bed and there's no outside soil that's uncovered to wick water in. So you may have to actually lift them up and water in February or March when it's pouring because you're not getting any water on your plants with those covers on. Overheating is a significant issue when you're using clear plastic films or cloches, and you have to pay attention to what your environmental conditions are in terms of overall sun. And better models that are commercially made have things like this. It's a little vent. You can twist the dial, and there's one on each end. And so if you're a sunny day, you can just twist those open, let some air flow through. You've got to remember to close them before it freezes, though, at night. But air circulation becomes an issue where fleece and remay and such, they tend to breathe pretty well, allow reasonable air circulation. So kind of a quick month by month or 2 months at a time for some of the early ones. What's going on? January and February, you can pre-germinate your peas, you can direct sow seeds, or you can sow seeds inside for transplant later. You can start onions and cabbage and lettuce inside for transplant. Probably don't bother direct sowing any of those crops until maybe at the very earliest, the very end of February, first part of March. You can start cole crops like broccoli and cauliflower inside in February for transplant in mid-March. I wouldn't usually push them out any earlier than that. Sometimes I've done them as early as the end of February from a January start, so it's certainly doable. Also consider your overall situation and think about the amount of area that you're going to work and plant for the early crops. And maybe you might want to put a little hoop house and some cover or other support structure and some cover over it, some impervious cover, and see if you can get that to dry down a little bit so you can work it any earlier than the natural rainfall allows. This is practical in a raised bed situation. On a typical in-ground garden situation like what I work with at home, it's not, because you get so much lateral movement of water in the soils that just covering a small section seldom gains too much. By March, you can sow a variety of crops. The end of March might be suitable for direct sowing carrots, but beets and radishes, onions, spinach, chard can all be direct sown in March with no problem. March is when I would start looking at doing actual potato plantings. Usually about, we like to use like a St. Patrick's Day as a kickoff, but sometime in the middle part of March, you're definitely warm enough that the potatoes are going to grow faster than they rot, and that's kind of your limiting factor there. There's this narrow window of time, usually starts right around Valentine's Day and runs through about the middle of March, and I usually try to catch about the middle of it in early March, where you can get bunches of onions. So you can direct sow onions, and they take a long time. You can sow onions, particularly these long season onions like Walla Walla Sweets and some of the storage types like Cobra. You can sow them in the late summer, grow them over the winter for next summer harvest, which is ideal. But you can also let somebody else do the work of that for you, and you can buy these greens. So just if you had started your Walla Wallas in roughly August, September in your garden, they should be about the same size as these bunches you're buying, because that's what they did. And so you buy these bunches and you transplant the individual onions out from the bunches. And it's often easier in really bad soil situations, or simply from the fact that it's really hard to get good onion germination in August unless you're pouring a ton of water on it all the time. Just an easy way to get your long season onions going without some of the hassles of trying to do it yourself in the late summer. That really ends up fast, usually about the second week, maybe a third week of March. Those are gone for the year. There's just a very narrow window you can do that. By March, you can successfully transplant pretty much all your major leaf crops and cole crops. So you can transplant any of your lettuces, spinach, bok choy. You can also transplant broccoli, cauliflower, cabbage, Brussels sprouts. Earlier in March that you want to try to push these crops, the more you will have success by adding some extra cover onto them, just to make sure they get a little more push, because the plants are growing by this point in time, but the insects are starting to pick up, and you've got to get those plants really pushing to keep that step ahead of that first few crops of aphids, for example, or cutworms coming out. By April, you can actually direct sow most crops that are sufficiently frost hardy to grow. So broccoli, cauliflower, cabbage, all greens crops. I wouldn't direct sow bok choy any earlier, though you can transplant it earlier. In addition, some of your really quick turnaround crops, you might be actually getting to a point where you might want to refresh a lettuce crop, or radish crops with a really fast turnaround. You might have some gaps. The other thing you'll see happening in April we'll take a step back for a moment and say crops that are in the ground, like overwintering cabbage and overwintering cauliflower and even sprouting overwintering broccoli, they start pushing pretty aggressively in February. You want to pick up your feeding a little bit. And somewhere in March to early April, you'll start harvesting the heads off of those. Usually by early to mid-April, you're finishing up the harvest on a lot of those overwintered crops, and you'll want to take them out so you can conserve that space. Rotations matter. This is not space that you can put another cole crop behind. You need to save that space, maybe for some nightshades in the main season crops. Put some potatoes in, fine. Put some peas in, fine. But don't take your overwintered cauliflower out and say, oh, I got space now. I'll put my main spring crop of broccoli in, because you will have disease problems that accumulate. By the middle to latter part of April, you can transplant your hardier main season crops like tomatoes and peppers with good protection if you want to try to push the season. By the end of April, checking both your soil temperatures, but also your forecast, your 10-day forecasts, it is possible you can maybe direct sow some beans or some corn. They are quite a bit more temperature hardy than you think. And late April, I frequently have done beans and corn that early. But you do need to watch it, because we can get busted by a sudden frost snap, and you can lose them if they're in a sensitive stage. So watch what your soil moisture is doing to see if your soil texture is decent. Watch what your forecasts are saying about frost, and double check your soil temperature before you try to push that one. So kind of covers the early season. Then we're talking about the transition as we get into the main season. And a couple of things. It's easy to get super gung-ho about doing this off-season gardening and realize in the end of April or first part of May that you didn't leave enough space for the things you're planning on planting for the summer. So take the time to plan ahead as you're doing this early season gardening. Same thing with overwinter gardening. And to give yourself the space you're going to need, and think about your layout. And this is a good thing to be doing now while you are doing your very earliest planting and you're doing your seed ordering, is to kind of get, you did a good map and you kept good records of what you had where, right, for rotations and all that, right? So I'm great at it too. I get messed up from time to time about overlapping my rotations a bit by not remembering exactly where I had everything, but remember how much space they take. Plan that space, map that space, whatever it takes to make sure you have the successful space you need to grow the crops that are really important to you. When you're looking at your spring, whether you're overwintering for spring harvest or your early spring crops, be aware of how long they're going to be in the ground. Peas are a great example of this. So peas will be growing through the late winter, early spring, harvesting spring into early summer. By June, July, they're done. Might be able to follow up with a main season crop like a bush bean crop, or maybe a quick turning tomato even. You may want to consider that saved space for fall and winter gardening, because that space will free up 3 to 4 weeks ahead of your drop dead date for planting a lot of those crops. So think about that. Also, as you've got your young broccoli plants that are starting to finally size up, and your young cauliflower plants that are finally starting to size up, and you're moving into the main season and planting tomatoes and sweet potatoes and other fairly substantial crops, remember that those broccoli are not done yet and they need some space. So don't encroach on them too much. You can encroach a bit because they will be gone by the time your tomatoes are getting up to size, but allow an adequate amount of space. So like cole crops really need about a 2 foot by 2 foot space. Basically it shouldn't be any closer than that. Don't let anything encroach onto their space. And always remember those crop rotations. It's an easy mistake to make, and even doing this professionally and doing this for so long, I occasionally get myself into trouble by not following my rotations perfectly. So a classic example. Now, I see what I was talking about earlier about my water table. You notice that my lawn is lower, my vegetable garden's a little bit higher, and I keep a nice little trough down the middle. This has changed. This is a few years ago, and I've expanded that vegetable garden quite a bit over the last few years. But this might be something you would be seeing in February in your garden. In your top left picture here, I've got a young. It's a cole of some sort. I forget which one that is. I think it was a cauliflower. It must have been. So cauliflower are not that hardy. They take damage once they're starting to actually develop their cauliflower heads. They start taking damage somewhere in the 20s. That's 20 degree, 25, 24, 25 degree Fahrenheit range. So if you're growing overwintering cauliflower for spring harvest, you often need to do little cloches. This is actually a little remake cloche I made to protect them to get any harvest at all. It's nothing more frustrating than to have a great success through the winter garden, and then just about the time you're getting baseball sized on your cauliflower, you have a really hard freeze, and you kill all the flower heads out. The tube crop here is simply expanding my slowly developing pea crop. That was a direct sow. I germinated them inside only and then transplanted them as germinated seed. They're high enough above the water table, just barely. It gets a little swampy out there in the winter. February 6th, lettuce. That was sown mid-January. It took almost 4 weeks to get cotyledon level germination. This is why I don't normally push it that early. It is doable, but it's seldom worth it. Allium crops in the ground. Often garlic, onions, and shallots. And as we're getting into February, you start feeding them again as they start growing for anticipated harvest roughly June. And of course, the bulk of the garden, as you can see out here, and you'll see them close up here, a mixed cover crop to keep weeds down and to improve the soil. So that's kind of a transition of the early garden and into the main season. I want to talk just very briefly about what you do with your cover crops, because it's an easy problem to get yourself into. It's important when you're transitioning from your winter cover crop to actually planting in the space that cover crop is growing, that you take into account allelopathy. So when you incorporate a cover crop into the ground, assuming you're using a cover crop that needs to be worked in, like a grain cover crop for rye or wheat, or like clover, it goes through a breakdown process. In the early stages of that breakdown process, it is giving off byproducts that inhibit the germination and sometimes the fine root development of other plants. It's allelopathic. How long a period that is depends on the conditions of how fast it's breaking down, but also which type of cover crop it is. And grains are the long-lasting ones because they're very fibrous. It takes a longer period of breakdown before they get past that stage. So you can't, in most cases, simply hoe in your cover crop and plant, whether you're doing that as peas in January or whether you're doing that as tomatoes in May. You need to go through a process. So for early plantings, like my peas, for example, and you can see it very clearly in the picture here, I actually removed the cover crop, moved it over into the garden where it could decompose and be part of the garden, so I didn't lose the benefit of that cover crop I had growing, and then chopped the soil and planted right through there without allowing the breakdown to be happening where I'm planting the seeds, thus inhibiting the germination. Typically, as you're transitioning to the main season, you want to take a little different approach because you want to keep that cover crop benefit. And so if you're using a till-in or a hoe-in type cover crop, you should go through and you should be making a plan that is like 3 to 4 to possibly as many as 5 weeks ahead of your anticipated planting. And you want to go through there about 4 weeks ahead roughly and cut the cover crop. So this is February, this is still small. In April, that's knee high. So you want to cut it, let it lay for several days out to maybe a week, incorporate it, whether you're chopping it in, rolling it in, or actually tilling it in. And then your allelopathy period post incorporation can be as short as about 7 to 10 days for clover, out to about 2.5 weeks for rye. And so during that period of time, that soil is going to have some problems developing plants. And for transplanting, it's a little less critical because you have established plants with healthy root systems. You may get a little bit of root damage here and there, but not much. But for direct sowing, it is critical because those seeds won't actually germinate under those conditions. So basically 2 to 3 weeks after incorporating that cover crop, Now you can go through and do any follow-up soil amending and direct seeding and planting. But that allelopathy will trip you up. I had a heck of a time with that when I was learning it without realizing that was what I was running into. Another approach is simply to use no-till, and which is a solid means of conserving your soil microbiology and structure. You can do both cover cropping and no-till. You have to use different cover crops and slightly different strategies. For example, vetch is a great cover crop for no-till because you can have your vetch growing over the winter. When you're ready to plant, you can simply hoe the crown without incorporating it, without disturbing the soil too much, and just plant right through the residue. And you don't have much allelopathy, and you don't have this huge biomass that takes forever to break down. So do that extra planning ahead as you're transitioning from your cover crop or from heavy weed crops. It's the same thing to actually planting, and you'll be much more successful. So that's what I had to talk about this evening, and I would entertain any questions either in chat or if anybody wants to unmute and talk to me, I'll take it that way too.
Darren, have you used any of the silver mulches?
Silver mulches, I have not. What have you had any experience with them?
No, I was just reading about it in the territorial seed catalog. They talked about silver mulch for some of the melons.
Yeah.
Success. I just was curious.
I have not, and it's actually a fairly new product on me. The reds and greens have been around for a while. I would anticipate you're going to see a lot of the same things, a nominal gain on a large scale measuring, but probably not hugely significant to the average home gardener. Okay. Most of these mulches, that's been the case. Oh, Lori, onions that didn't bulb last year but are still growing. A little more clarification. So when did you plant these? Okay, so you planted them early spring last year. They've gone through an entire summer cycle and now winter. I suspect you will not have anything out of them. I don't think it's gonna hurt you. You will know for sure by April, May. They'll start bulbing if they're going to. They won't finish until June. Okay, so a batch of things that can theoretically cause that to happen: irregularities in moisture content, substantial variations in temperature can sometimes cause them to simply fail to bulb. Usually, though, when that happens, they bolt. They go to seed, and if they did not actually seed out and they didn't bulb, that's kind of unusual. You'll see bunching onions might do that, but your typical bulb forming onions don't usually behave like that. So not 100% sure on that one past that, but at this point, I would say it probably wouldn't hurt anything to let them go, because you'll know well in time to make use of that space, at least for the main season crops, if they're going to bulb for this year or not. Squashes, like cole crops or other requirements for rotations. Okay, so your rotation families. Nightshades. Nightshades are your potatoes and your peppers and tomatoes. Eggplant. They are a group. They all have the same basic diseases. Cole crops, all your broccoli, cauliflower, cabbage, kale, but also bok choy, also turnips, rutabagas, and radishes are coles. They're crucifers. So they are a group in terms of rotation. Your squashes fit in with the cucumbers and melons, cucurbits. So cucumbers, melons, and squashes are a group in terms of rotation. So separate from that. Your cole crops and your cucurbits are completely different families, and they need rotation, but those two can be alternated. Legume family, peas and beans. A few other things. Watch a little bit with cover crops. I tend to try to avoid doing a lot of vetches or Austrian field pea, where I know I'm going to be planting peas, because they're also legumes that you can build up some disease and particularly insect problems with things like pea weevils. And then carrot family. Carrot and parsley and parsnips. Covered the basic groups there. So anything that's within one of those groups should be not planted following it, and anything, but can be planted anything that's not in that particular group. Best time to sow cover crop. So you guys are gonna get a little bit of a giggle at us, but there is nothing stopping you from throwing some cover crop in August right into your standing crops, except crops that are super, super small or super intolerant of competition. So I like to get my cover crops in August to September where it's possible. And a lot of my garden, it's not possible because I'm still harvesting clear into October. But your crops that you're harvesting that late, things like pole beans, tomatoes, peppers, you can cover crop under them. Yes, you'll damage some of that cover crop when you finally take them out at the end of the season, and you'll have some bare patches. But it's better than waiting until everything's out of the garden. So my recommendation is start as early as the end of August and sow anything that's empty. And by the time you're hitting the middle of September, just underseed everything and not worry about too much about what it is, but get it going. You're using clover and vetch. Those are great cover crops in terms particularly of nitrogen fixing and the ability to no-till them. Clover, you can no-till. It's a little harder. Vetch is easy to no-till. If you are not wedded to the idea of no-till, I love to see you put a grain into that rotation. Grains are a little harder to control in a no-till situation. Not undoable, just more challenging. But they provide an additional level of protection from things like garden symphylan and some other root pests, as well as providing a huge amount of biomass. In addition, they're simply better scroungers than legumes. Legumes are great at taking nitrogen out of the air and putting it in the soil. But if you've been fertilizing over the season and you've been putting some nitrogen, you've been putting some phosphorus in, even some potassium in, it's not a bad idea to conserve any of that plants haven't been used. And grains do a good job of gathering those up and holding them until they get broken down. So that's timing on your cover crops.
Darren, I have a question about leaves. I don't do cover crops. I have very small raised beds, and a lot of Japanese maple leaves, cover my beds. And I always wonder if I should incorporate those in the spring or remove them.
Absolutely. Okay, Nancy, great question, and we get that one a lot. Okay, so to visualize what happens here, so you put 4 or 5 inches of leaf mass on your leaves, on your raised bed, and you kind of crush them down, and then you leave them there over the winter, and the microbes from the soil are coming up into that mass, and they're beginning to break down that mass, break down the lignins in that, and start to convert it into more broken down soil components. So those microbes that are finding this rich food supply in terms of carbonaceous mass, lignins in that leaf mass, are using nitrogen from the soil to reproduce, because there's not much nitrogen in that leaf mass. It's primarily calcium and carbon and such like that. And so they're moving up and up into that pile to find more and more of that nutrient to move into and keep breaking down. So then if you go through in end of April and you tear that off and you move it out of the garden to finish composting or whatever, you have now taken not only some of the biomass you've been trying to accumulate, but a lot of the available nitrogen from that soil is now trapped in those microbe bodies up in that leaf pile, and you've just moved it out of the garden. So the answer is you want to really incorporate it into the garden, or if it's broken down enough, simply chop it a little finer and plant through it so it can continue its decomposition cycle. As it finishes decomposing, those microbes run out of food, they die off, and they return that nitrogen to the soil.
Darren, did you say that the grain cover crops help with symphylands?
They do. So it's about living space and soil depth. Vetch helps too. Vetch has enough of a root system and a deep enough root system to help. But grains are our primary cover crop defense for garden symphylan in the sense that their root zones occupy a huge amount of the soil underneath those plants, and they deny those symphyllans basically space to grow. Symphyllans can accumulate in some grain crops. That can be an issue. So again, rotations in grains become important too. But using the grains as a cover typically reduces your symphyllin population. A few other root pests too, but symphyllin is the one we focus on the most.
Okay.
Well, I thank you all for attending. It's been a wonderful evening. Thank you, Alan and Deb, for inviting me and hosting and all of that. I really appreciate it.
Great.